Hello, so today's going to be a continuation of my rank guide that I made a couple of days ago. This is going to be me giving some introductory or some easy comps that you can try out in the current set of TFT. So this is for set 13 of TFT. Now, before much ado, if you are returning to my channel, a large number of you are not subscribed, so please make sure to like and subscribe, especially if you like some of my content that I have made in the last couple of days. At my sub goal of 5,000 subs, I'm going to be giving away art store coupons because that's my new art store that's going to be opening very soon. As a disclaimer, so when I say this is for beginners. I'm trying to make it as beginner friendly as possible. If you're not a beginner, this is probably not a good video for you. What I am doing is I'm trying to pick and describe easier comps to play from my own experience and what I see as common mistakes for people playing the game. This is for beginners. These are not the quote-unquote best comps, the highest placing comps, the strongest comps. I'm trying to pick comps and explain them. Some of these will be some of the best comps, but overall, I'm trying to give suggestions of, hey, based on what your lobby is doing, these are things that might help you out if you're a little bit lost, or if you're not really familiar with the TFT mechanics, if you feel like you don't know what to do, and you feel like you're losing a lot of the time. That's what this is for. It's for those players that are just starting to learn how to play the game. This is because of requests for easier and reliable comps to play, because a lot of times, like, just looking up, hey, what's the strongest comp in TFT, there's a lot of conditions for those comps that makes it a little bit difficult to play towards them. So I just wanted to put that disclaimer out there. I want it to be very clear because I don't want people to be critically analyzing what I put up and telling me that these aren't like strong comps or whatever. I'm trying to say, you know, at different levels of play, different things work. And I'm going to try and say what I think are reliable comps that you can get your footing with, and then once you get better, maybe play towards some of those higher cap versions of these things. So let's start with the first thing. Whenever I'm talking to beginners, I usually recommend playing reroll. Reroll just gives you more opportunity to play with things that are in front of your face rather than things that are much distant in the future. You have to do a lot less planning because you're basically just playing around the units that you see in your early game, and you can structure your plan a lot more easily, as well as spike a lot earlier, which in turn helps you to focus on other things like positioning, scouting, what items to take. There's lots of stuff to think about, so if you know very early what you're doing and have a good plan, a lot of times it's very helpful. If you want to learn, first of all, rank up, I have my rank up guide, so this is a continuation of that one. But additionally, I do have a how to play reroll guide if you want to know like at what stage, when to roll, what times to level, when to go for certain units, etc. This is like a general go-to guide that I made a couple of weeks ago that you can check out. So in terms of reroll comps, we're going to start with one of the first ones. This is actually a very strong and currently like quote-unquote meta comp, but this is Renata reroll. So with Renata reroll, you're basically trying to carry Renata in the backline. The main thing that you need on Renata is an Archangels, in my opinion, as well as a Shojin and some sort of attack speed. So here I have a build which is Shojin, Nashers, and Archangels. Archangels is very crucial for this unit. The way the unit works is that she attacks, she fires these missiles, and then when they pass through the unit, like any of your allies, they give them a shield. So the idea of this comp is you're trying to stall out as long as possible, because this Renata will scale up with the Archangels, and then she will not only do a bunch of damage to the enemy, she'll also she'll shield, your frontline units. So it actually synergizes very well to play Sentinels with this, and a lot of times you'll play around re-rolling the Renata with the Irelia, which you can 3-star, but typically you 3-star the Singe. Singe gives a bunch of attack speed to the most damage dealing unit, so it synergizes really well with making the Renata cast a bunch more with the attack speed. So typically you go for 3-star Singe, but this comp is very flexible and it's very easy to play because depending on who you hit, you can basically 3-star everybody if you really want to. Even Vex as a backline damage dealer, this is a viable option, but you can also stabilize pretty easily if you hit just 1 or 2 of the 3-stars. So for example, a lot of times what I will do if I'm playing this comp is I would just go for Singe 3, maybe Irelia 3, but a lot of times after that I'll just push levels. When you get to this point, your max cap, or the way that you can easily cap out this board, is just playing the traits that are on the left side of your screen. Typically, you want to prioritize playing more Sentinel units. So for example, you can put a Lowy here, and then later on you can find a Loris, but ideally you find a Rumble at one point. And playing 6 Sentinel is going to be very strong for you. If you look at the positioning on the board, I have it a little bit awkwardly positioned. The reason that I put them is that usually you want Renata to be somewhere in the middle of the board, like in the middle of the back line, and you want the units to be clumped relatively close to her. The reason is that when you fight an opponent, you want these units to kind of like make like a little bit of an arc shape like this, and that way you have a greater chance of her shooting when she's attacking the enemy units to shield your front line, to stall out and make them as tanky as possible, because you want her bullets to pass through your own teammates to make them shield. So a lot of times you start the fight out by giving them like a little triangle or a clumped shape around the Renata. Additionally, this comp is very easy to play because if you can't hit certain units, you can stabilize around other units in your in other points. Here I just put like 3 rebel because you get the HP buff on the Sentinel rebel units, which is very nice. But you can also play around like a Morgana. Typically Morgana is your go-to if you're not like finding an early Alawi or anything like that. Additionally, because you're playing vertical Sentinel, all of your low-cost units have a lot of tankiness because of the Sentinel trait, so your frontline items become really easy. A lot of times you can just make, like, you know, anything works. Usually you try not to make armor if you already have Sentinels in, so a lot of times you're trying to make HP, but it also gives you a good opportunity to make utility items for the comp. So all in all, it seems it's pretty okay to play. The biggest problem you might have with this comp is it being contested. It's also a bit tier and rod hungry because you need to not only make a mana generation item, you also have to make a archangels. So you have to play it from an AP spot a lot of the time, but it's a pretty reliable and consistent comp that you can try out. Another one cost reroll is the family reroll. This one you usually play with AD items or melee items. With family reroll, you're basically trying to carry a Violet as long as possible. So Violet, you try and go for Violet 3. You can once again 3-star everybody, but a lot of times you go for Vander 3, Violet 3. If you can hit everybody 3-star, that's totally fine. Powder is kind of useless. No offense to Powder. It's just that you're trying to play this more with AD rather than AP. So Powder kind of falls behind in terms of the damage, and typically you're just playing it around the Violet with melee items. If you end up 3-starring Draven is quite good with attack speed, so giving him like Gwynsus are really nice. With Violet, you can basically make many different builds that are good. Something like BT Starex is good, just frontline AD items. Edge of Night is good if you want her to like get de-aggroed so she can have a second lease at life to live. You can also go for like a crit build. I talk about a lot of these when I talk about unit itemizations, but like a crit build you can build, so you can go Hodge, IE, right? You pair up crit glove items to give her like good crit chance, but it's quite flexible. You can even go like Titans. There's many different options, so you don't have to pigeonhole yourself into a particular set of items, but even if you do, a lot of times it's just AD, like swords, gloves, bows, belts. These are the type of things that you would want to put on the Violet. Tank items can go on Vander, utility items can go on Vander, tank items can also go on Darius in your early game. If you want to make this board better after actually hitting your units, you can push levels, and you just have to play vertical pit fighter. You have enough frontline with the family, and you have enough frontline because the pit fighters are good at healing each other. If you can make it to a high level, like a level 9, and just play 6 pit fighter, you cap out very high. Additionally, you can also play extra family emblems, which you can then put on a higher cost unit to get the family bonuses of 4 or 5 family. There's lots of augments that also help out this comp in addition to just like the general combat augments, because there's stuff like Welcome to the Playground that gives you family units for free. So if you find yourself in a good spot, you can become very strong very quickly. Here's another comp that I want to say. This is going to be the first one that is more of a hot take comp. I don't think I made a couple videos about Maddie and snipers, but I'm going to mention Maddie reroll as a viable option, especially if you are a beginner player. So Maddie reroll is a way to play around AD items. Right now, AD items are very hard to play around because there's not that many good AD 4-cost lines that aren't conditional. What do I mean by that? There's a lot of AD 4-cost units, just like AP, but like a lot of times if you get dropped a bunch of swords or a bunch of like bows and you can't play around an AP unit, the AD units are very middling at 4 cost without certain conditions that you have to plan for ahead of time. We're going to talk about some of those comps after. So sometimes, especially in lower levels of play, a lot of people end up just defaulting to spamming reroll comps. This comp is very good because a lot of times when people are playing reroll, they're trying to play around Sentinels a lot of the time, either rerolling Vex, rerolling Renata, rerolling Morgana. A lot of times people are playing around these type of boards or these type of boards. If you look at both of these boards, what do they don't have? Any of the bruiser units. So a lot of times if you're in a spot, you can actually hit this board very fast. I would not play this board if you are playing like if you are contested. Like if somebody else is playing enforcers or Maddie or bruisers in general, I would not play this comp. What I'm saying is if other people are rerolling a bunch of stuff, they typically don't buy Maddie and Steb and Trundle, and if they're not buying those units, you can easily 3-star all of them and then play around this line, especially if you have AD items. Now typically on Maddie, what I like to do is you have Guinsu because it helps her over time. You have IE, which helps her to do a bunch of damage, and then you have usually because IE is a crit glove item, I usually put Last Whisper with that so that she has like a good crit build with attack speed. Frontline items are great for bruisers. You can just put armor or more HP or utility items on them. And then to cap out this board, there are many ways to cap out the board, don't get me wrong, but what I usually do is I just play 6 bruiser. So something that's really important whenever you're playing these boards, I always say to cap out the board, you're usually going deep into one trait, which is like the frontline trait. Something that really helps out when you're starting out in TFT is having a strong frontline. When you're playing a bunch of synergies, a lot of these units do nothing. But when you have a lot of frontline units, it gives your backline units time to attack. And that's really important. It makes it much more consistent and much more reliable that your opponent, if they have a bunch of damage, it's hard for them to chew through a big frontline. A lot of times early game, mid game, as well as like beginning of late game, whoever has a better frontline typically wins the fight in TFT. One of the telltale marks of the round going poorly in TFT is when your frontline is dead and their frontline's still alive. Because your carries start to die and then everything falls apart. So a good mentality to have when you're starting out and you're trying to like learn the game is to make sure that you always have a really strong front line. So that's why I suggest stuff like this. Now, if you're playing Maddie, technically this version of this board caps out a lot higher if you play vertical enforcer. 6 enforcer or even 8 enforcer is a lot stronger than playing 6 bruiser 2 sniper. However, having the bruisers in the mid game makes it so that these low cost units that you're probably going to find very easily will be useful because you have such a large amount of HP because of the bruiser trait. So it makes it a lot more reliable. You won't get wrapped as easily. You won't get like cheesed out by certain fights. A lot of times you'll be like a front to back style comp, especially in the current meta. There's not too much backline access. It works out quite well. And I think that would be a better way to have success when you're starting out, is just to guarantee a really strong front line, worry about your back line. If you feel that you lack damage later in the game, you can always take a board like this and drop some of the bruisers and play some extra snipers in the back line. Like if you find a Caitlyn, for example, or you can play into enforcers. But typically this is an idea of something that you can play, especially if other people are playing around the other boards. Now, we're going to go to 2-cost rerolls. Renata is technically like a 2-cost reroll, but a lot of times you roll it like a 1-cost reroll. I talk about it in my reroll guide. I actually mentioned the Renata build in that version because it was still relevant back then. But here, I'm going to give you a couple boards that play around Tristana. Tristana scales really well into late game, so she's quite easy to play. If you see an early Tristana, a lot of times you just want to build her with like good damage items and attack speed because she gets so much AD. So a lot of times you can build her like with a full crit build where you do something like Guinsu, Infinity Edge, Last Whisper, which works out really well. Or you can go for full damage amp. A lot of times like Giant Slayer like is really good on her, especially late game. But basically the way she works is if she kills with her ult, she gets you get bonus stacking attack damage, which is very nice. But typically you want to make a Guinsu on Tristana. Sometimes I think one of the better builds is something like, you know, IE, so she crits on her ult, and then sometimes you even put Gunblade on her because she does so much damage that the Gunblade actually sustains your front line. When you play it, you always want to get to 4 Artillerist at one point if you're playing around Tristana. So typically you're playing around Urgot as well as these 2 units. In your mid game, you just play a board like this where you have a nice, stable, strong front line, and then you worry about stuff later. In this case, I'm showing you a build where I have 4 Sentinel. When you're rerolling for Tristana, it helps to reroll for other 2 costs. In all of these comps, whenever you're rerolling units, buying the same cost of unit makes it easier for you to hit multiple copies of those units. because like if you buy a bunch of Tristanas, you're less likely to see Tristanas in your shop, which means you're more likely to see the other 2 costs, and then if you buy the other 2 costs, you're more likely to see the other 2 costs, and then it's like a snowball effect where you hit a lot more easily because your rolls become more efficient. So a lot of times you go for Tristana 3, you can go for Urgot 3, you can go for Rel 3, you can go for Leona 3. Depending on what you need. If you need frontline, as soon as you have 2 units upgraded, you can start to push levels to get to that 4 artillerist, because that will usually help you out most of the time. So a lot of times in this type of board, I'll hit like Leona 3, Urgot 3, Tristana 3, and then I'll start pushing levels in order to play around the 4 artillerists. Now, this is a version with Sentinels. This comp is quite flexible. You can play the same thing, but with 4 Bruiser as well. So the same idea applies. On level 6, you play 4 Bruiser, and then you play the Tristana and the Urgot, and eventually you level and you play Corki and Ezreal to get in the 4 Artillerist. If you're playing around this comp and you hit Urgot 3 instead of Tristana 3, if you're primary carrying Urgot, this is a little bit of a better board that is more complex, but it is a meta, like quote-unquote meta or strong board, so I wanted to mention it in the same way. This board has a lot of options. I don't mean to overwhelm you, but it's just a matter of like, if you see a lot of people playing Sentinels, you could play this board with Bruisers. If you see a lot of people playing Bruisers, you can play this board with Sentinels. And if you see that you hit Urgot 3, you can then just play a Zyra, right? Urgot and Zyra experiment, Zyra experiment bonus on Urgot is very strong. So because it just gives a bunch of true damage. So if you play around Urgot here, you can just make like melee frontline items. A lot of times it's something like a Bloodthirster, a Starax, and then something like maybe like a Titans. You just want to be super tanky and super strong frontline unit. And then if you pair the experiment bonus with Zyra, so here I'm just going to put a little symbol. I'm just picking a Chembaron item just to symbolize that you're experiment bonusing the Zyra. Urgot does an insane amount of damage. So you can play this type of board where in your mid game it's a little bit more confusing, but this is usually if you're playing around Urgot, if you hit Urgot 3, or if you hit an experiment +1 and then you're trying to play around experiments. This is a reliable board where you can play around Urgot. It's a little bit more challenging, but this is like this is a strong board that works out as a nice plan B if you're playing these boards, and instead of hitting Tristana, you hit Urgot. You could just put the Tristana items on the Urgot, get the Zyra for the experiment bonus, and then you can play around this type of board instead. I just wanted to put it out there because, you know, it's something that's like, you know, it's like the elephant in the room, because this is one of the more reliable comps to play. Finally, one comp that I really like, especially if you're starting out in terms of reroll, is Zeri reroll. Zeri reroll is very underplayed, and you're playing around Watchers. These Watcher units are very strong. At the beginning of the set, Watcher hasn't really been changed all that much, but Watcher is still one of the best frontline traits. Vertical Watcher is one of the tankiest frontline options that you can have. Even with a bunch of nerfs, Scar is still an unkillable demon. Garen is really contested, but he's very strong if you find him in this type of setup. And all the other units, they can do insane things. Like Vander is a giga tank. Darius can be really tanky at times. Amumu is a giga tank. You have these good options for frontline units. This used to be a meta board where you would reroll with Kog'Maw. I will mention Kog'Maw reroll in a separate video. It's going to be coming out either tomorrow or the day after. I'm going to do a general automata guide, which I will talk about the automata units to no end, similar to the other guides that I post on how to play X board, right? I will do that after. I do not think just starting the game off and playing around automata is a good idea for beginners, because it is a very complex board that has a lot of different stabilization points that if you don't identify them, you just instantly die and go 8th. It's a 3-cost reroll typically, so it's a little bit more awkward, and you can get really dizzy or really confused in terms of how you itemize and how you play around it. There's a lot of conditions to make it work. This board, however, if you play around Zeri, is a lot more reliable and a lot less conditions. Typically you need to hit Scar 3 and Zeri 3, so you can roll on level 6, try and hit Zeri 3, and then eventually go for Scar. Zeri does a lot of damage. Late game you can cap out your board even higher by just playing more Firelights, because you're going to be playing Firelight as your main carry. And then Zeri, you can play AD items, so it's a good AD option. Zeri, you can either go for full crit, something like Guinsoo, like her items are very flexible because she has this effect where she doesn't have mana. She just does every third attack, gets extra physical damage, and she also does like a lightning strike where she hits a bunch of other units. So she's actually really good at killing backline units because over time, if you give her a ramping attack speed like a Guinsoo and the Scar and the Watchers are unkillable, she'll actually start killing some of the backline units before you even kill the frontline unit because she has this zap effect. You can go for full crit, like something like IE Last Whisper. Or you can play for, like if you have an early red buff, like if you hit Pyromania or something like that, she actually works really nicely with it because she applies the burning with her zap attack. So sometimes you can anti-heal the backline and cause them to get some burn effect on them, which is really strong. She's also good with Deathblade if you have a plethora of swords, but there's lots of different builds. Typically you just want to have Guinsoos on her. Even 2 Guinsoos could be good sometimes because that zap effect is just going to rack up damage. And then utility is really good because she spreads it to multiple units. Scar is really flexible in terms of his tank items. You can make armor, healing is really good on him often. So a lot of times you can just make him like a Giga Tank. Something like Dragon Claw with Bramble Vest are good options. Where's Bramble Vest? With a Warmogs, right? HP. You just get a really, really strong front line. So it works out quite nicely. Now, those were some reroll comps that I wanted to mention. Like I said, there are other reroll comps. I will talk about them in future videos. It's just that, like I said, I went through this. I looked at a lot of stuff. I spent a lot of time working on it. And I think that these are ones that I think are more reliable if you're starting out the game. Like if you don't know much about TFT and this is like your first set and you're just trying to do like a little bit of a ranked climb, I think you can have more success by making these type of reroll boards where you have really strong front lines, really okay back lines, and you just win out, or you save a bunch of HP because you're playing for placements a lot of the time and you don't lose too much in your early game because your front line becomes very strong very quickly. That's what I look for in comps like these things, and that's what I'm recommending. Now in terms of 4-cost comps, I'm just going to briefly mention a couple of 4-cost comps in case you are somebody who wants to play around 4-cost. I also have a 4-cost guide, which you can check out if you want to get an idea of how to level and how to play around those units. This is something that is on my channel from a couple weeks ago, but it's still relevant in terms of just giving you a game plan of how to play around the 4-costs. Now, if I'm thinking about what is one of the easiest traits that's very reliable to play for beginner players, it is definitely Rebel. Rebel is not one of the strongest comps overall in the set. It is not one of the highest cap comps in the set. It is very reliant on hitting a Jinx eventually. However, if you're starting out the game, it is very easy to play because all you have to do is click the Rebel units. It's very, very simple. You just click the Rebel units and you can plan around playing the different units. Now, I made a Rebel guide recently on my channel, so you can check out that if you want more details of how to play Rebel. But typically, you will just always play 7 Rebel on level 8. You're really reliant on finding your Alawi, which is one of the harder parts to do. So make sure that if it looks like people are playing Sentinels, be careful with your rolling because you might not hit Alawi. But overall, it is a quite easy comp to play because you just have to play around the Rebel trait in general. It's also quite flexible, especially if you have an emblem, because like I said, you're just playing all of these units. As long as you find some synergies, you have a little bit of a frontline synergy with 2 Sentinel, you can basically put in anybody. You can put in Elise for Bruiser, you can put in, if you have a Jinx, you can put in Echo for Ambusher. If you were playing around other units, like you can put like a Jason, for example. Any 5-cost can work pretty nicely. You have good flexibility. In terms of itemizations, with Zoe, you really like to have attack speed. So a lot of times it's Guinsoo with a bunch of damage. So something like Guinsoo with, what's it called? Guard Breaker and Jewel Gauntlet is nice. Zoe has an effect where she can hit the backline. So she's really good at cheesing fights. So if you give her like high crit or high damage amp, these are things that are going to make her kill the backline before the front line and sometimes just cheese and win you the fight instantly. On Jinx, you eventually want to put mana items on her. So, or at least 1 mana item and then like full damage. So something like mana item and crit items are good. Additionally, when you're playing 4-cost comps, because there's a lot to play around, a lot to plan around. Here I kind of showed you like, okay, like these are some Zoe items. These are some other person items. You can also stabilize around Ezreal a lot of the time. If you get like AD items and AP items as a mixture, you could put some items on Ezreal, some items on Zoe, and then late game you could transfer them onto a Jinx if you find her, and if you don't find her, you're going to be relatively stable around carrying these 2 units. In terms of Alawi items, You can play pretty much anything on her. A lot of times I put utility on her because she's so tanky, but armor, MR is also okay because you're not playing super deep into Sentinel. But a lot of times HP is really good, as well as like durability. So like, you know, you can just think about Giga items on her. And they'll probably be fine. Right? But, you know, it's okay. I wouldn't worry too hard about the Alawi items. But like I said, I talk about items in other guides. I don't want to focus too much on it here. Another really easy comp to play is Sentinel Heimer. So Sentinel Heimer is one of the quote-unquote really strong meta comps right now. So this is going to be a very contested comp. The way that I always recommend beginner players to start out with this comp is just to play around Vertical Sentinel. It makes it a lot less cumbersome because basically what you do is you just play around Sentinels in your early game, right? You can easily play like a board like this or anything like that. And then if you're eventually playing around Heimerdinger, then you can just play Vertical Sentinel with the Heimer. You get the Visionary synergy because one of the Sentinels is a Visionary in the form of this Rel. And then you get a free Academy item. So if your Academy item is good, you can play around that. Here I have a level 9 board where here I have 2 dual carries of Heimerdinger with Corki. When you play 6 Sentinel, you basically just hold on to your low cost units because often it's really hard to do like these late game transitions where you sell all of your weaker units and know exactly what's stronger. But I always recommend to just like max out the Sentinel trait. You can play 6 Sentinel with a Heimer in the background. Heimer, you typically, because you're playing a really strong front line, you want to give him a mana item. I think the best item, is something like Blue Buff Nashers, where you get a bunch of attack speed and Blue Buff helps him to cast more. But if you're playing flexibly, like I talk about in a lot of my other guides, you can just make a Shojin Nashers, and then you always want to have an Archangels. You could play other items besides Archangels, but because you're playing a Sentinel heavy front line, your front line is going to be very strong. The fights are going to last very long. So then you instead want to give him an Archangel because then it scales him throughout the fight. If you get AD items, then you can put them on Ezreal and then eventually move them onto a Corki, which might do more damage late game. You don't need a Rumble to hit 6 Sentinel because you could play a Singed instead, so even in your mid game you should be relatively stable. There are better ways to cap out this board. I made an Academy guide where I talk about like higher cap, you drop some of the Sentinel units, right? And then you play around Jace and you play around like some more like higher into the Academy trait to get more damage. But if you're just starting out, just playing the Sentinel units will help you out a lot with this board. Another really simple board to play is Silco. So Silco is another AP board. Now Silco is more confusing because the board looks a bit more weird, but basically you're just trying to play Black Rose and Dominator. It's quite flexible because you can play deeper into Black Rose or deeper into Dominator. This board is easy to play or pretty nice to play because you have so many different options for frontline units. If you hit Garen 2, you can itemize Garen 2 as your frontline. If you hit Mundo 2, you can itemize Mundo 2. If you hit Elise 2, you can even itemize Elise 2. Typically, your main go-to is to play around Garen, because with the Watcher trait, he gives a bunch of HP to everybody. But you have multiple options for frontline, so you have good options for stabilizing your board, even if you're contested, or even if you're in a bad spot, because basically, you'll be able to upgrade somebody. Additionally, with Silco, you want Shojin Nashers almost always, because Dominator, you need him to cast a bunch, and this is a good item pairing to help him cast, because he gets a bunch of AP from his Dominator trait. A lot of times you make a Jewel Gauntlet or some sort of damage amp item in order to ensure that he does a bunch of damage. But this board is quite reliable to play, even if contested, because you have so many options for frontline. Even if you don't upgrade Silco right away, upgrading any of the frontline units will give you enough stability that a lot of times, as long as your spot isn't ridiculously bad or you're like really harshly contested, you have a good opportunity to still convert that into some net elo. Now, AD comps for 4 costs are a little bit harder to play because they're all very conditional. One of the strong AD comps is playing around Bruiser's Twitch. So Bruiser's Twitch, you need to have experiment bonus on him, so you can't really fit in everything on level 8. You can't fit in snipers, experiment, and 6 bruiser. So a lot of times this board is very weak unless you have a bruiser +1. So unless you get a frying pan or a bruiser emblem, you cannot really play this comp. But that's what I mean by it's conditional. But this is an easy condition to remember. If you see bruiser emblem, you can just play around Twitch a lot of the time. The reason is that with Twitch, you just want to ramp him up with a Guinsoo. You can go for Guinsoo with full crit build, but a lot of times you like attack speed. Late game, you can put in Caitlyn as your main sniper or your main dual carry, and then you can move some of these items onto Caitlyn. But typically with Twitch, you need to have experiment bonus on him, because without experiment bonus, this unit does not function properly. It just does not work well. You have many options to upgrade your front line because you're playing deep into the Bruiser trait. You can stabilize around Nunu 2-star. You can even stabilize around Rennie 2-star sometimes. But typically you want Bruiser emblem on Mundo. Mundo scales with HP really well. And then you have experiment bonus on both Twitch and Mundo, and you make it work out. Elise is a bit hard to find, so sometimes you have a little bit of a struggle to get to the 6 Bruiser. But if you could find the Elise, then you can just play this board as well, and it works out pretty nicely. Lastly, this is another board that is quite flexible. This is playing around Emissary. I did do an Emissary guide where I talk about it to like no end, so I won't talk about it too much here. This is a little bit of a harder board to play, but I did want to put it as a possible AD option. Typically, you're playing around the 4 Emissary trait, and then with the 4 Emissary trait, you could usually carry around Vi and Corki. Now, when you're playing this board, it's a little bit more complicated. I wouldn't recommend this, but I want to put it at the end of this video because a lot of times people are asking me what are good AD options. This is what I mean by like they're not very conditional. We'll see if the set evolves in such a way that there's better AD options for everybody. But if you're not rerolling with AD, it's often hard to play AD unless you get into a really good spot. So the main condition for this comp is to be very rich. I did do an emissary guide on my YouTube channel, so I would recommend watching that to see more about this particular comp, because I don't think it's super beginner friendly, but this is more like if you're like somewhere between like transitioning from beginner to like advanced experienced player that you think that you can like carry your climb to like much greater heights. This is something you want to put in your Swiss Army knife toolkit. Basically what you do is you just need a bunch of gold. You need a bunch of gold because this board relies on a lot of 4 costs, and it also relies on actually hitting these 4 emissary units in order to play the board. So you can carry Mbessa with melee items, you can carry Vi with melee items. Garen is really strong to give HP to your front line. A lot of times Corki is the main damage dealer. Based on whatever you hit on level 8, you then play these 3 auxiliary units in terms of which units you hit. If you hit Corki, you want to have Scrap in. If you hit Mbessa, you want to have Quick Striker in. If you hit Vi, you want to have Pit Fighter in, etc. So you just try and fit in some of these other units, and then you make a very strong board by level 9. Anyways, thanks for watching. That was the part 2ish, talking about some most consistent or best comps. So I tried to pick the ones that I think are the most consistent when you're playing them. I did technically go over like most of the comps in the current set. It's just that like, you know, I'm trying to give you guys options, as well as like, you know, you can try out each of them like one time. If you have success with one of them, then you can kind of play that comp more often. When you're beginning, like I said in my original guide, I always recommend just focusing on 1 or 2 comps at most. All the way up until silver. When I first played a year ago, the way that I got out of silver pretty easily was I just played 2 AP comps, 2 AD comps. I picked one of each. I looked around, whichever one was contested, I took the other one. If they were both contested, I picked the one I had a better spot for. And then up until gold, where then I added to my arsenal and I started to play like 4 or 5 different AP AD comps until you get good enough at the game where you understand what makes a comp good, how to stabilize the comp, all of these other things that come with experience from playing, and then you can add more to your kit. So here I just wanted to show you a brief overview. Like I said, if you are very beginner and you're just starting out, I would recommend more of the 1 cost and low cost reroll comps, because those ones you'll see the results of being stable a lot earlier and it takes a lot less planning. However, if you feel like you want to just play 4 cost because you think that's fun and cool and interesting, then by all means I showed you some 4 cost comps as well. Thank you for watching. Hopefully it was informative, and like I said, these aren't the quote-unquote broken amazing comps. Some of them are, but I'm showing you variations of them and versions that I think will help you to climb. Whenever you're climbing, one of the main things to do when you're starting out, make sure you have a really stable front line and a really stable back line, and then work from there. And that's what really makes a nice, consistent, and happy comp and a happy climb. Thank you for watching. Hopefully this was enjoyable. Tomorrow will either be an automata guide, because I didn't mention automata units here, even though they are very strong, because I don't find it very beginner friendly. And then I will make a scrap guide I think I owe somebody, and then I also need to do a positioning guide. So we have a lot of other stuff. I have a short list of all the things I'm working on, but I want to complete and bookend this little ranked little bit, and then we're going to talk about some of the other stuff, and then we're going to continue with more content. Thank you for watching. Have a great day, and see ya.